Welcome to the 11th episode of the Chrono Time podcast. If it's your first time listening in, we discuss one particular film per week, and we do a film analysis slash cultural analysis, in my opinion, of that film. This week, we're going to be discussing Kill the Messenger, a 2014 film directed by Michael Cuesta. Stars Jeremy Renner and Mary Elizabeth Winstead. Based on a book titled Dark Alliance by Gary Webb, who was a journalist in the San Jose Mercury News, and who wrote, I'm going to say before we get into the movie, who wrote a very, I'm going to say controversial article about the CIA's involvement in the supposed war on drugs, and also especially in Central America and Latin America in general, and how that all shook out with, the Mercury, the Washington Post, the New York Times, also the U.S. government, and then also in general, I hope to discuss this a little bit about America's role in Latin America, and also the war on drugs, which I have felt has been, if we talk about militarized police, this war is one of the reasons why we have that situation today. Connecting back to some earlier discussions we had about race and police. But to dive into the film, I'll let you start off a little bit, but I'm curious about as a film, before we get into any of the themes and topics, as a film, I guess, we've covered a lot of good films recently. I'm curious about what you thought of this one overall, even though it's probably not going to rank as highly as some ones we discussed before. And, what did you think of obviously the performances and kind of the style?
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying that typically for a lot of the films we cover, they tend to be a little more non-mainstream, if you will. So this is what I would consider a more mainstream type of film in terms of the storyline, its style, and directing. I personally, I guess there's a little bit of bias. I like a lot of Jeremy Renner's films. He started in a film a couple of years ago called, I believe it was Wind River, which I really enjoyed. If you haven't checked that out, I would highly recommend that movie. It was really good. So I would say this movie for a general audience is more digestible because it's sort of like a suspense thriller that's based on actual events. I thought that his acting job was fairly good throughout the film. He really did sort of, I thought, Gary Webb justice, because it's a complex character to sort of play in terms of some of the paranoia of being sort of tracked and followed, and really stirring up the hornet's nest of the CIA. So overall, I did enjoy his performance. Obviously, some of the events were a bit sensationalized, but because it was based on sort of true events, and because I will say this, there's some personal bias that I think both you and I have to this film. Personally, because we both grew up in San Jose, California, and the film stars someone who was an actual investigative journalist for the San Jose Mercury News, which are our hometown paper. So it was really interesting sort of learning some of the details revolving around this sort of true story and events. So while it wasn't quite as great as some of the other films that we've reviewed, I think that this is a film I would definitely recommend to a lot more people than some of the other films we've reviewed.
Yeah, I mean, to jump in real quick, first of all, you say you're a big fan, but I don't think you've watched all those Avenger movies.
I would say a lot of films that I've seen of Jeremy Renner in the past.
Yeah, come on, where's your analysis of Avengers and Infinity War? I should definitely pick that eventually, but just to tick you off. But
well, anyway, go on.
Speaking of the film, yeah, I will say that this movie, this is one that I felt was very traditional in its. When I say traditional, I mean in the modern sense, what modern filmmaking has become, and at the box office, because the story was not hard to follow. The performances were very good, and it had a standard sequence of the what I call the beginning, middle, and end, right? And we've done other films where it's a bit more experimental. You don't really know if there's a beginning or end. I'm thinking of Tree of Life. And then we've done some other films where the it had the tight structure, but like the topic and the acting performance were just like American History X, where it was very like powerful and like the topics were really explored. But this one, I think this is the trick with any, and we'll probably will do more of these types, but this is I think the dilemma that people who do like biographical films have is that you want to tell their story, but it still has to be a movie. So like it kind of constrains you creatively. You know, you can't just, send Jeremy Renner to, Mars, and tackle some interesting themes there, right? Like you have to keep it wound to the like you said, even though some parts were sensationalized, you still got to keep it wound to the what I call like the bread and butter of like, San Jose. Like it has to, you can't just move in places, So in that sense, I think that's why this movie, when it comes to like the film analysis, isn't like I'm not that I'm a expert, but there's not as rich a discussion as some other ones we've discussed. I think what's interesting about this one is what I think the film was trying to explore is the story of Gary Webb, the book, maybe even like get people to read his book, even though I haven't. But also I think people forget that because it's not covered that well, in my opinion, in American history at the high school or even collegiate levels of how America in the Cold War era operated with not just physical wars like Korea and Vietnam, but also the coups and kind of political games it did in the 80s and 90s with Latin America. And I think when I bet some Americans maybe feel this when they do travel there, like there is some kind of animosity because they were seen as meddling in situations like Argentina, Chile, Nicaragua, like that. You could argue that the U.S. have really that much business in, even though you could argue as a superpower it's our sphere of influence. But there's the counter argument that we could have treated our neighbors much better.
Yeah, I mean, this film really touches upon the extent of sort of the U.S. government involvement and what they're willing to do to influence our sort of motives in other countries. So within this film, it was really something that was unveiled that the CIA had some knowledge of drugs that were being brought into the United States to help fight the Contras to overthrow the more leftist government in Nicaragua. Just going more towards like what you were speaking about and our sort of sphere of influence and why really there is a level of animosity globally against sort of the U.S. We've had quite a lot of involvement and try to push our agenda in other countries. I mean, you can even go back to, I believe it was in the 1950s where we helped sort of overthrew the Iranian government. We had like a big involvement there. You talked about sort of in more Latin America with Chile and Nicaragua and really other countries. In Chile, we propped up Pinochet. That sort of leaves a lot of sort of bitter outlook from a lot of people within these countries towards the U.S. because we've meddled quite a bit in foreign affairs.
Yeah, and don't forget Cuba too. So,
I mean, you can go everywhere. I mean, we were even going. I mean, you can look at the Vietnam War, even in Asia, the Korean War as well. Like we were all over the place.
Yeah, what's interesting about Cuba is that was always seen, from what I read, that was always seen as the one weak sore spot that the Pentagon always viewed as something that they messed up, because Cuba is the only place, because the difference between Nicaragua and Cuba, or even like, let's say Chile, is that even if the situation went south there, it's still, a missile would have to like travel a decent amount to, to hit America. While with Cuba, why they were really paranoid and why we were on the brink at one point with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the World War III, is because Cuba is a strategic, if you're let's say a foreign power and you want to have a strategic, like on a military, a logistical level, Cuba is like the ideal, because you're within quick hitting Florida and Miami, and that's why there's always been this, I think, paranoia around Cuba, and I think it's led to mistakes, because I think, like I said, like you were hinting at, that animosity helps fuel basically a dictator maintain his control. Where I think if there was a little more carrot versus stick approach, we could have had a different Cuba today. That's my opinion. But.
Sure. I mean, yeah, you can always, it's sort of this revisionist type of look, like you could look at any number of moves that really could have led to a different outcome. We don't really know what sort of could have happened, but we definitely didn't handle everything in terms of our foreign policy in the past in the best way possible in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and what I've always been curious about, especially with Cuba, is like, we know about this, like I said, what actually happened, but those people wanted to revolt because they saw that a lot of their, wealth and hard work was going to American corporations and who were basically, milking the agricultural industry, and that just feeds into like, potential liberator, and we often see that these liberators end up not being so altruistic themselves. But going back to the Contras in Nicaragua, the Contras were like, they were active from 1979 to 1990 about. So
in the early 90s.
So this is a group that's like, this is what also surprises me about American foreign policy, is that like, because I'm thinking of the modern example of the Taliban. When people are fighting for like their lives, for what they believe is their livelihood and their people, their land, they will like go to like extremes of survival, right? Like,
sure.
they will live in little jungles and they'll eat nothing and they'll just scrap and they'll fight until like they can fight no more. Well, like I think American like power, being a superpower, thinks that like they can just flip the switch, blow up a few buildings, and like mission accomplished. When it's a lot harder than that to win the hearts and minds. But yeah, Nicaragua is also, and even today in the modern version of the war on drugs, it's still a hotspot for how, goods, well, I say goods, but how some product is moved between
illegal narcotics
between North America and Latin America. Because Colombia, like, I mean, we can be here for a while, but because it's like Mexico is the focus point. Mexico is now in my opinion, the power when it comes to illicit illegal drugs, especially when you read stories that the boats from Mexico are getting to Europe and also Asia. But like obviously, like Colombia, everyone who's seen Narcos knows about Colombia now, and other countries, are involved in this game. And like I said, the drug thing we can get into further. But going back to the Mercury News and stuff, because I think there's another topic in there because we're jumping on the drugs a lot, but there's also how like Gary Webb was in many ways, when I was watching the film, Alex, I don't know if it hit you, but I was like, this guy got canceled before there was cancel culture.
Yes.
And it reminds me what Chomsky always says about, we live in a society where, what he calls manufacturing consent. And I remember this interview he did with the BBC, where he says to the BBC interviewer, like, you're only in your chair because the system allows you to be in your chair. As soon as you deviate, you will be deplatformed. And that is what happened.
Yeah, it was interesting because I saw another interview with Gary Webb after looking at this film, and I'll sort of paraphrase more or less what he said, but because I don't remember the exact wording, but it was sort of to the extent where he's like, no, I always held, because he had been in investigative journalism for approximately 25 years prior to that point. So I always held sort of the view that, we were doing a lot of good, that we were seeking out with the utmost truth. But it turns out I had never unveiled like a truth that was worthy enough of getting pushback or being like repressed or silenced. And really within this case, that's sort of what ended up happening. So to add a little bit of context, what was also interesting is this was one of the first stories to really blow up on the web. This is 1996. There's no Google. Yahoo was barely a thing. And people were sort of starting to transition online, but it was like the very early days of dial-up. This is like when technology was really rudimentary in terms of going online. So it was interesting to see that this was sort of getting pushed. The story was getting spread all over the place. And on top of that, a lot of the mainstream newspaper outlets still had huge levels of power. They still have a lot of power today, but even back in the 90s, it was more immense because, newspapers were pretty much your way of, there was no Twitter, was no social media. There was none of that. Your sort of news outlet was funneled through these three main really papers, which is the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. And then there's also the Wall Street Journal. There's a couple others. But those are like the big players at that point. And so Gary Webb pushes this article through, and the San Jose Mercury News, which is sort of a mid-level paper, right? They decide to publish this story. And this is a big deal because they're not known for putting out these big explosive pieces like this, right? And what ends up happening is you get pushback from all of these big newspapers. And I'm not saying that this article was perfect. I've read parts of it. I don't know the complete factualness of like his reporting, but it was just interesting seeing the systematic pushback by all of these three papers and sort of conferring and agreeing with what the CIA was saying. They were just their mouthpieces, right? And so because he was a mid-level, or he was working for a mid-level paper, sort of exposing the story that took place really in LA, it was very interesting seeing him just be silenced, partly because, at least from sort of researching this a little bit, partly because they were pissed that they weren't, basically these gatekeepers weren't the ones that were exposing the story.
That's a great point, actually, and got me thinking. But I just remember, like, I didn't read his piece, but I've read enough fringe journalism where I think this is the dilemma they have, where there is like a thread of truth, but because people can't, are either afraid or don't want to go on the record, a lot of, the articles, that you read, like, this supposed source, and you need, unfortunately, I think you do need at least a mix of on the record sources that are like willing to put their name forward, and then you can mix in maybe like off the record type of sources. But I think when your pieces are just off the record, it becomes easier for, like, I'm going to say, traditional institutions to throw holes into it. But I think in this kind of topic, and also, like you said, the time period when you had, let's be honest, like an established media elite, it's harder for people to feel comfortable saying, like, I'm willing to go on the record and might be named in the story,
Well, and let's be honest. So he did have some sources that were really willing to go on the record. So if you look at it, like, it was actually true that Danilo Blandon, who was he was one of the people from Nicaragua who was smuggling drugs to the U.S. and selling them into Los Angeles to bring back money to purchase weapons for the Contras to fight their war. Because, this is a very complicated sort of storyline, because there's a lot of factors moving between U.S.-Nicaragua relations. At the time when this sort of story was all unfolding, Reagan was in office. He was a pretty popular president at the beginning of his presidency, but Congress banned him from they wanted to fight this war against the communists in Nicaragua, but Congress banned him from actually funding these Contras. So what Gary Webb sort of unraveled to an extent was that essentially there were some people who were pro-Contras who were bringing drugs, into cocaine specifically, into the United States, and they were selling it on the streets in Los Angeles, and then that money was being funneled back to the Contras there. Now, the CIA didn't specifically sell this, but basically what he was saying, he's like, it was sort of, they were turning a blind eye to what was going on to allow this sort of war to be fought back in Nicaragua. Now, it was basically like you were sort of saying, like, hear no evil, see no evil kind of deal, where because you knew that this was going on but didn't really do anything about it, you were essentially just destroying a lot of communities, and you still see a lot of the fallout in a lot of urban communities in the West Coast and all over the U.S. I mean, Watts, Compton, South Central, a lot of these neighborhoods in Los Angeles just became absolutely decimated by the introduction of crack into these communities. And it's really sad that was a lot of the collateral damage that came out of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the Cold War era foreign policy, it was kind of like there was always the view that communism was the existential threat, so any means necessary was pretty much how they operated. But yeah, I mean, the Contras were basically a right-wing group, which honestly, again, this shows you how like the American public isn't often engaged enough. Because I think if you were to actually poll a lot of Americans about the Contras viewpoints and should we even put any money in general, I bet you a lot of Americans would have been like split at least, or even maybe slightly leaning towards maybe not so much, because I don't think we should be giving money to these like right-wing groups. I mean, I know that the junta was like like I said, the paranoia in the Pentagon, but you know, like in general, I think Americans, citizens are not like, I probably can't even tell you where Nicaragua is, unfortunately. But I think that's one of the issues is that like if you ask most Americans who are, let's say, even high school educated, like, oh, should we give money to this right-wing group and this is what they stand for, this is what they do, I bet you a lot of people will be like, I don't think taxpayer money should go there, you know? I actually think America has that kind of like isolationist kind of like pattern of like, yeah, we want to like help people, but let's not try to like, you know, funnel money to like a right-wing group, or even if it's the left-wing group, right? Like, you know, not that they would do that, but you know, it's interesting how the Pentagon operates, or I'm gonna say the Pentagon, but like the foreign policy guys operate like with some free hands, and you know, they're never really held accountable unless they blow up, like they start a war, like, you know, and even then they're not really held accountable because they're not really like, tried in court or anything. So the I think for a long time, American, you know, foreign policy gurus have had it easy, because I think now, at least in general, my sense is that no matter if you're, you know, a progressive or a conservative, most Americans are kind of tired of this. They're tired of being blamed for everything. So they're kind of like, I'm done. They're done trying to like, you know, blow up a certain country or fund this country, you know. So we'll see how that evolves over the next like 4 or 5 years. But you know, when you read about like what happened, not just the Middle East, but like I said, Latin America, like it just seems like, you know, there's like you said, there's a lot of fallout domestically and abroad that like, you know, one could argue that like, did it really work even? Like, were these countries really going to become Soviet Union hotspots? And the fact, I mean, they can never predict the Soviet Union would collapse in like, you know, 1989, 1990. But honestly, all that work was for what exactly? Because the Soviet Union they had so many internal problems that they literally collapsed, you know, and like they weren't going to be, you know, funneling, you know, all these money and resources to Nicaragua of all places. I actually think that this American paranoia did a disservice, because I think the strategy was all off balance. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to see the lengths to which the U.S. government would go to try to prevent communism abroad, right? And I take the case of like Chile in the 70s, like they were very afraid that Chile was electing a more leftist candidate was a democratically elected leftist candidate there in the 1970s. And the CIA helped stage the coup, and you get a right-wing dictator in Pinochet there. And while some of the economic policy or growth that Chile has experienced was slightly due to some of Pinochet's policies that he put in place, his sort of legacy there was absolutely brutal, in that you had millions of Chileans who just were simply banished and wished away by the government, never to be seen again. I mean, it was absolute like mass murders that the Pinochet government sort of enabled and was responsible. And we were the ones who put them in place there. And so you can sort of understand why a lot of these countries would have bitterness towards the United States by putting some of these puppet government leaders into place, into positions of power to then rule over them. Right?
Yeah.
I would, if someone did that here in the U.S., we'd be absolutely furious too.
Yeah, and I think, and that's why I speak to the failure of U.S. foreign policy. But yeah, with Pinochet, I mean, this is the same guy that like he literally used soccer fields as death camps. So I mean, he's not really high on my list of people in the world ever. But like, yeah, I mean, and I think the reality is that Americans, some Americans who are, I would say, really like introspective, and one could argue maybe a tad bit self-hating, but they have recognized that like there was this great fusion between Friedman and Hayek and the foreign policy guys. Because what was always the strategy? Topple the government, put our guy there, and he's going to privatize all the industries we want so we can make even more money. Yeah. Right? Because the myth of the 70s, 80s, up to now, actually, I think, because I think now even a lot of Americans are turning against this. was that privatization of everything was the way to go, and when you prioritize water, land, it's one thing to privatize, maybe like, something else, but when you start prioritizing what people actually need to like just live, that's when you got to like, when you read about it, you just got into like, people were just dying because they didn't have the money to drink water, clean water. So like, this was the great marriage that existed for a long time, was these Chicago school guys, and then the, Pentagon paranoia of communism. And yeah, I mean, it's probably going to take many decades of American leadership to even repair that, even though time has passed, because like you said, there's been a lot of damage done there.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I want to get your take on sort of it seemed like it was a coordinated effort to discredit Gary Webb's claims. Do you think that it was something that was just completely random amongst all of the mainstream news outlets, or do you think it was a more sinister, coordinated effort?
Okay, this is a good.
I know
one.
This is very tough, and this is getting into
this is a good one. This is a good one. Conspiracy theories. Okay, I'm actually anti-conspiracy theory. I do believe that like the JFK thing, people are still obsessed about that, and I know why people find conspiracy theories appealing, because something that's so, like I say, a big event being kind of random makes no sense to most people's minds.
Right.
And even the supposed suicide. Yeah, sorry for people who haven't seen the movie or read the book, but Webb did. People have said that he didn't commit suicide, but I actually think that in this particular situation, he did, even though the 2 shots thing is harder to do, because once you're deplatformed, the state doesn't really think you're a threat anymore. So like, he lost his career, his marriage, like they already totally castrated him. But when it came to when the peace broke, to answer your question, I think that it was maybe not coordinated amongst all the papers, but I think, I think the U.S. government knows how to, because I think what's interesting about Webb is that he was before Chelsea Manning and Snowden. And it was and I think maybe, I don't know if Snowden knew about Webb, but I think Snowden tried to make sure he didn't fall in that trap of like, I'm gonna make sure I have evidence, real evidence, hard evidence that can't be denied, because I know what the U.S. government's gonna do. I'm a traitor, I'm a sellout, I'm a double agent, and I'm like you said, like I'm fabricating everything, and it's not true. Because I remember initially that's what they tried to do with the NSA leak. Oh, this guy's making it up. There's no such thing. We don't have these programs. And he said, look, I'm leaking all these documents through WikiLeaks. I forgot which documentary I saw that was really good about Snowden. I know he has a new book, but it really covered. I know Glenn Greenwald was the journalist he trusted to do this, but he covered in depth of like, here are the documents. Here's everything you need, like with timestamps and stuff. And
it's there. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a whole nother topic about like our American response as a public to it, maybe because we're too addicted to our phones. But with Webb, I think he was like a precursor, where like he was saying things that was going to disrupt the national intelligence community and the U.S. government. And I think it's where the United States uses soft power. I don't think it got every freaking newspaper and said, this is what you're going to do to discredit the guy. I think they took the call from the Washington Post. They probably knew him, right? Because there's always these connections, how they do the stories, right? With Washington and the big newspapers. And they say, no. And then like, gave alternative facts or other versions of the story, because the U.S. government's good at spinning stories to not be so not to do it, like they don't do a 180, but they always plant those seeds of doubt. So then the guy on the other side is saying, oh, you know what? That's plausible too. Then the doubt. See, they only need you to doubt his stuff, like Webb stuff. So I think it wasn't like coordinated by the journalists per se, but I think it speaks to maybe these media companies are too connected to Washington with their sources and their people. And I think soft power is what did them in, because I think in the end all the papers were like, oh, the New York Times is believing this. Why us at the WAPO not going to believe this? And then boom.
One of the big issues is that Gary Webb did not have a specific source within the CIA who was willing to actually go on the record, right? And he, quote unquote, had some people that were going off the record. But this is an organization that is incredibly secretive in terms of what they do. And so it's really hard to get someone to sort of turn and leak, some of the abuses that may or may not be going on within this, secret intelligence agency. And clearly they are like, because they're not really willing to go and sort of, give evidence of any wrongdoing there, typically, it's going to be hard to get someone to go for Gary Webb to like flip someone, whereas it's going to be very easy for all of these other people to go on the record sort of discrediting Gary Webb or what he's saying, and which is why like all of these other papers had CIA sources.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think the sad unfortunate truth for Webb is that he needed somebody, because what's interesting about the Snowden story is that he went to the media, like he found like the journalist he could trust and went to a foreign country to tell him the whole story and give him the information, because. And I've listened to a lot of like Snowden's like JRE interviews, and like I do want to read his book eventually. And I saw the documentary, because I believe Snowden is I'm going to say something controversial here. I do believe he's an American hero in the sense that he risked everything to at least give us, the American people, the full picture. Now, if we choose to do nothing with it, fine. But like we should at least be aware that like these programs exist, even if it's for our benefit. I mean, if we agree with these programs, but we should know. I mean, that's the whole point of our supposed constitutional democracy. But I think unfortunately for Webb, he just, like you said, he didn't have that smoking gun of a person. And like you said, like with the CIA, you need somebody very courageous, like a Snowden type, to like say, okay, you know what, I'm okay living in an embassy like Assange for like my rest of my life if I have to, because when the U.S. government puts their eyes on you, especially when it comes to foreign policy, especially with our network or allies, there's a reason why, like, even though I don't think Assange is like the paragon of virtue, there's a reason why he's stuck at an embassy. And none of the other supposed free countries have any of the stones to even say to the US, we don't think what you're doing here is right. Because in the end, and this is why China is, I think, understanding this too, in the end, what matters is the hard power. And like, whatever all the idealism, the ideology stuff, that comes second to, you don't want to screw with us because we will definitely we'll definitely disrupt your life. So I think, so I hope I answered your question, but I think it was more of America using its softer power, because in this sense, I don't think they have to be so coordinated and get all the like CEOs in the room and tell them like discredit this. I think they can just do it by turning some knobs and, like you said, getting the other sources out there, the other points of view, and chipping away at its credibility.
Yeah, so the other thing I sort of want to say, and this is just my personal opinion, I view Gary Webb in a very high light, because although not all of the facts might have necessarily lined up, I think he was trying to expose some bigger truth to like actually have the American public see what's really going on behind closed doors. So in that way, I kind of view him in some of the same light as Snowden, in that he tried to like expose light on this very complex, very interesting event that took place in U.S. history, and for that he really lost everything. So I hold him in very high light because of that. Now, I would agree with you that I don't think it was necessarily like a meeting, but to be fair, or to sort of elaborate on my opinion, I think that is probably the way that the CIA went about it in terms of casting doubt, but that is still a coordinated effort, right? The CIA manipulated these entities, and these high-level papers had so much influence and power pre-internet. I mean, they still have a lot of power today, but their power has sort of been lowered because of what the internet has sort of become. But in the 90s, they had so much power that, man, they could just squash, and everyone was going to trust them as the main news information, right? Yeah. And so because it was just so weird to see everyone at these, like, there were responses from the LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, I believe even like a Miami paper. There were like papers all over the place. It just was weird to see them just completely cancel one of their own in that way.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, yeah, I think I can agree with you that like the papers may not be like all like together, calling each other and like planning this out. But you're right, I guess it is organized if you take it from the CIA's perspective. I guess I was trying to answer your question in terms of like, did I think the papers all like I said, Miami Herald, New York Times, they all got on a phone line and had a discussion about it. I just personally can't see.
Well, I think when they were verifying the facts, I think they were all coordinating together in a way.
I mean, to a point, I bet they were calling each other individual journalists. I just don't think the institutions themselves, because they're companies, really, they were.
The companies was still a lot of power and influence. I mean, back in the day, everyone read the papers.
Well, I mean, they still have a lot of power because I even think of how like even
they do, but it's not. Look, when was the last time you really read a physical paper? Whereas when I was a kid, we always had the paper delivered. People were always reading papers all the time. Now, a lot of people get their information through Twitter or other.
Well, I was ahead of my time. I've always read online. So the physical paper was like garbage. My grandfather did read it a lot though, but and I guess my uncle does too. He likes the physical papers.
But you get my point. Whereas like pre-internet, that was your only like avenue of information on what was going in terms of news topics, right? Were these big papers or your local paper if you had that. But the big ones that had influence were the Washington Post, New York Times, and really the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal. That was it. So they had so much influence because of that, because they were the only game in town, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, I do agree that like them turning on their own, I'm not that surprised to be honest with you, but that was probably what Webb wasn't expecting. Because like even if the story, let's say it had let's say holes, let's say hypothetically it had holes.
Yeah.
I think he was probably surprised that was pretty much the death sentence of his career. You know, like he got, like I said earlier in our conversation, he got canceled before there was cancel culture per se.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm thinking more like what I consider to be the fusion between the press and the government, having studied like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. America doesn't have that now. There's a lot of corruption and there's a lot of, wink, wink, nod, nod. But there isn't this infusion of like China. Like when you read the Global Times, which I don't know if you have.
Yeah.
It just reads like, oh my goodness, this reads like completely like a mouthpiece. Like I can't even like people. But you know what's funny? People read this as if it's the New York Times to them. Some people. So that just shows you how different world it is sometimes. But I'm telling you, you gotta read a couple of those pieces because it just straight up reads like it came out of like Xi Jinping's office.
I've actually read some of their Chinese propaganda pieces.
And the New York Times, I specifically know a lot about the New York Times, which I won't get into, but I personally don't think that paper is always clean. They definitely have a certain view and slant. And this is the same paper that criticizes one president for, being a Russian agent, but at the same time was all for mission accomplished in Iraq. I mean, they should have been hard against Bush as they are against Obama, Trump, all the guys. Because if you're truly anti-neocon, which is the stance I do have, but instead, it's selective because in the end, it's whatever benefits them in the power dynamic. Which you can't say is free journalism because you're not really free if you're a slave to something. But it's an institutional power though, because I think we can both speak to the fact that I know a lot of people who read that paper and believe that everything that comes out of that paper stuff. And so I guess and all that stuff. But anyways, go ahead.
Right. So I guess that was in terms of having more coordinated effort. I think that it wasn't just like coming from the CIA. I think it was even amongst. So everyone knew like when you're at basically how it works for those of you who don't really think about it or outside of it. When you start off as sort of a journalist, especially during the 90s and 80s, you start off at more local papers. You start publishing you're a beat reporter. Eventually you work your way up and then you use your position as a launching point to go to like a mid-sized paper, right? Then you get some traction and do that. Your ultimate goal is to end up at the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the LA Times, right? One of the big dogs. That's sort of the trajectory that most journalists want to go to get to the top point and sort of the pinnacle of your profession. And so I think that it really pissed off the key players in this point that a mid-level paper like the San Jose Mercury News was dropping a piece that was this sort of shocking and revealing.
Yeah, and actually to go back to the movie, there is that scene where their initial reaction like, 'cause I don't know if it's this like sentiment was fabricated or it was truthful, that the LA Times, their journals, the editorial room was like, how come you didn't get to this story first, right? Because at first they were like, how did we miss the biggest scoop of the year, right? Right before they flipped
which is true. I mean, that's believable.
Before they flipped the script on Webb, but yeah, like to your point, these big name papers are so used to being the standard for investigative reporting, and they were like, how did this San Jose Mercury News get here before we did? What the hell will happen? You know,
yeah, in a community that was literally 5 miles away from the LA Times headquarters. Exactly. Right? I'm sure that infuriated a lot of the gatekeepers within that industry.
Yeah, and so their initial reaction is, how do we miss it? Before they were like, oh, there's holes, let's discredit them. Because I think what the movie tries to also, because I think that movie is doing a lot of different theories, that potentially one of the selfish motivations for believing the CIA so truthfully and not questioning them harder is, oh, well, we want to make, we can't look like we're Dumb and Dumber, you know, like let's
right.
You know, let's discredit this journalist and this smaller paper, mid-sized papers. I would describe the Mercury.
It was a mid-sized paper, yeah. That's why I called it. I put like the top tier and then the mid tier, and then you have like smaller papers, which is like the Wichita Times or whatever. You get the point of like how.
Yeah. Like I would say like the Sacramento Bee is like probably like the beat reporter beat. Like they cover the local sports and some of the local news. You know, the Mercury is like mid-sized because it tries to do South Bay like. You know, Southern Bay Area.
It's just got a bigger sphere, I would say. But yeah, so that was pretty interesting. So what you have to say though is like he sort of unveiled a lot of interesting information, and it's really hard to discredit sort of what he was able to get out of Danilo Blandón. And not to say that I think a lot of people were sort of misrepresenting his words, because if you look at the pieces, and I saw some of the follow-up write-ups on it, people were saying that Webb was claiming that the CIA directly like sold drugs. He's like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying he like basically it was they sort of knew that some of these drug traffickers from Nicaragua were coming in and selling in some of these markets, specifically like LA and expanding east after that through like Highway or Ricky Ross. So they had this network going on, and they sort of turned a blind eye because they could not get funding from Congress directly, and so this was a way to sort of supplement the war effort in Nicaragua.
Yeah, and like if you think the CIA is going to be directly,
they're not going to be directly.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, if you look at I think you're onto like you hit the nail on the head there, because I think what he just uncovered with Blandón, that was like this mini smoking gun, because I know he wanted to get deeper with like the bigger story, as I would say it, but like that by itself, that like this guy was like, you know, basically an informant supposedly, and that was his involvement was in that, you know, drug game. That should have been at least a yellow flag to the public and to people in general that like, hey, you know, there's smoke here, and usually when there's smoke there's fire, but they didn't get to the fire yet. Right? It was able to unfortunately get crushed, but what's interesting is that the movie did touch upon how the communities that were affected by this, they totally believe that, because they just saw like an influx of drugs like suddenly just to show up on the street,
just out of nowhere. It was literally within the span of like 3 years in Watts, just ravaged the community. I mean, the cocaine epidemic. We talk about like, you know, what the opioid crisis is doing today. Man, within certain African American communities in the 80s, it was just brutal. If you see documentaries,
and so like you're saying, the community leaders, they were like, wait, this now all makes sense, because this just like you say, where there's smoke, there's fire. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the apparatus that exists here when it comes to corporate media is a bit disingenuous to the public, because we keep hearing the narratives like, oh, it's the free and open press. And I mean, I read the New York Times still, so I mean, I see this.
I mean, they have an incentive structure and an agenda that they are trying to push, whether you agree with it or not.
Exactly. And that's what I guess ticks me a little, is because I read the New York Times probably every day somehow. And it's always like, that's the message they push, like, you know, that they are the free and open press and that they are the arbiters of truth. And I go like, you know, even if I trusted you guys, like you were like this great paper and you tried your best. Like, honestly, that's a lot to say, you know, like arbiters of truth, and we are looking only at the facts and stuff.
Well, it's this dogmatic view they hold, where it's like the self-righteousness
yeah,
that
but
because there tends to be this glorification of of media that here in the U.S. that it's always used as sort of a check that it's specifically looking at sort of in the more what would you call it, in a perfect world utopian view, that it's always going to go and seek the truth, that there's going to be no bias there whatsoever. Whereas we all know, no matter what news outlet or news agency, they're going to have their own agenda and bias that's inherently driven. There's no sort of arbiters of truth is just some nonsense there, right? Because they're always going to have an agenda.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. It's like I have seen some good articles in the New York Times that I've genuinely enjoyed, but like, it's to the point now where like you have to kind of read other papers and stuff or other site sources just on the fact that you have to do your own diligence now, because just in case they're only spreading one perspective on a particular issue. And this goes for like all the papers too, but I found Webb's story like I found his story like after doing some research and watching the movie that he was basically in many ways like a precursor to the era we live in now, where everybody's talking about misinformation sources and you can look at certain facts in a certain light A, but if you look at it in light B, it gives you a different perspective. So it's like, so it's interesting how like Webb, if he was doing it today, he would have more options to be somewhere to not be deplatformed, and he would have had definitely more avenues to explore, even if he couldn't go the traditional route, which is what a lot of journalists now are doing, is that like if they can't go the traditional route, they're saying like, follow my blog, I'm going to this, like you say, independent, semi-independent.
Yeah, he would just set up a Patreon account.
Yeah. Or go to like these other aggregators where, okay, they're more controversial, but the editorial policy is a lot more, the journalist decides what goes in the story, and the people can scrutinize, or other journalists can scrutinize, And I mean, that has its own trade-offs, but yeah, early 2000s, late 90s, we were still in a world where if you were working at like you said, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, you had the keys to the kingdom,
Yeah. I mean, they had all the sphere of influence at that point. And one thing I wanted to sort of point out, sort of switching gears, I found it interesting because within sort of lacing this film are sort of historical clips that are cut in and out. One was like, obviously they wanted to show that the impact and the outrage that was going on in Watts and a lot of these communities during the 90s, once they found out that the story was dropped, and it led to a lot of congressional hearings. But like, I believe in one case you see like, I forgot the representative's name. I believe it's Maxine Waters down in Los Angeles. She was basically infuriated and called for a lot of congressional hearings. Then they had some other clips where they were interviewing sort of some CIA officials and their responses to all this. And I remember one, I forgot the exact CIA intelligence officer's name, but he basically said, don't give me this nonsense about conspiracy. Never in the history of the United States has there been a conspiracy. I remember hearing that, and it just absolutely blew my mind, the level of arrogance and the stupidity with which he said that statement. Because for years, declassified documents have been released showing some of these horrible, controversial conspiracy programs that have been taking place within the CIA throughout history. You can look at MK Ultra, when they were doing a lot of drug testing to see some of the psychedelic effects. They were, if you look at the details of that, it is mind-blowing the extent to which the CIA went in the 40s and 50s. And you can look at what was going on within the FBI sort of tracking programs with COINTELPRO. And so when I heard this, I was like, you got to be kidding. Your entire agency is essentially based on sort of conspiracy type programs, like some really weird programs that the public knows nothing about. And I'm sure if everything came to light, you would see a lot of conspiracies sort of come true. Yeah, but they want to hide that from the public. So I just couldn't believe the amount of arrogance with which he said that statement.
Yeah, I mean the black budget that comes from, I'm gonna say the executive branch, but there's some overlap with Congress. I mean, there's an argument that people have said that because people don't really want to know what happens there, right? It's like get the job done and we'll look the other way, or we just won't ask too many questions, because we didn't grow up in that era, but I know speaking to like my older relatives, that Cold War paranoia was like different. It was like it felt like World War III could happen any year, like every year it was like
for the Cold War.
Yeah, like my grandma tells me all the time that like, she just hated the Soviet Union and the communists because they could blow us up and they could destroy our lives and like this was the so when you have that kind of fear mechanism.
Yeah, it was the narrative that was being pushed. I mean, they even had nuclear fallout drills in schools.
Yeah, and so when you have that, then of course people are going to say, because this is often the debate, right? Freedom or security. They're going to say, yeah, we'll put more money in the black budget. We won't look. We just need to make sure that this gets taken care of, right? Because we're fighting an information proxy war, right? I mean, there was some I guess everything was really proxy because there was no direct conflict, right? Even Korea and Vietnam were proxy wars, but and also what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s. I mean, honestly, like to your point, because I remember that clip too. It's like, wait a second, we backed Bin Laden at one point before he turned on us, and you're telling me that we don't ever do these shady things? Like,
no, I'm not disagreeing with you that ignorance is bliss for a lot of the public that they don't want to know. But to say that there's never been conspiracy within mental institutions in the United States, where at the same time a lot of these declassified documents have been released to the public showing some terrible programs that the CIA has done in terms of research and development for any number of different agendas. It's just absolutely ludicrous. Yeah, if for the audience members out there, if you don't know, you can go look up two specific programs, which is MK Ultra and COINTELPRO, just to see the extent to which a lot of these intelligence agencies will go to. Were really sort of terrifying the more you sort of read up on them.
And you know what?
At one point, the FBI under I'll just make this one point. At one point, the FBI under Hoover tried to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. with all of his infidelity charges to get him to commit suicide because they viewed him as a threat to the state. Like, it's pretty far-reaching, a lot of what these programs do.
Yeah, and
anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, what's crazy is that as much as you hear about like MI5 and the CIA, supposedly like I'm going to say supposedly the KGB is just worse.
Yeah, I mean, we really don't. It's really hard to compare, given like who's worse amongst intelligence agencies worldwide, right? I mean, yeah, another one that you can sort of throw into the mix because I've heard some pretty terrible things that go on is with Mossad in Israel.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The Israeli intelligence service is also well known. Is also well known for their escapades.
They've done some wild covert operations. The more you read into some of their history, but yeah, so I just couldn't believe the level of stupidity of that statement. I'll leave it at that within that part of the film. But I guess one question I kind of wanted to ask you is how do you view Gary Webb? I guess sort of personally after seeing this film, you view him as like a hero or just sort of a tragic case in the system?
I view him as a victim of like I'm gonna say tragic hero, but like I don't. I'll use the term tragic hero, but I guess I was trying to like by definition of that is I think he had the unfortunate luck to be in a certain time period where he didn't have other avenues, and then once he was deplatformed, I think it really affected his life greatly, right? Because I think it's covered in the end of the film that he did end up getting divorced, the supposed quote.
Yeah, he got divorced in 2000.
The quote unquote suicide. And actually, what's interesting? I view him as a tragic hero, but actually made me appreciate Snowden. I hate to say his name a third time, a little more because he's been able to somehow like continue to live his life, and it looks like, you know, he's even getting married himself, and like he seems to like be at peace that like he had to sacrifice a lot, but like he's moved on. I feel like the more I read about Webb and how he like after this crisis hit him, that like it was hard for him to like go, in a sense that like that life that he had was over, and also that he was screwed by his supposed peers and allies in the U.S. government. And
Well, it's tough because I think he did feel betrayed in a way. I mean, I believe, I don't know if they actually published the redaction story to his pieces from the Mercury News, but the Mercury News, unfortunately, was just sort of a product of the times as well, in that they were afraid of a lot of pushback they were getting, so they sort of let go on the story. And it was so sad to see that after all of this, he got pushed to basically to the Cupertino branch, which is basically like, we're going to put you out of sight, out of mind, so that we won't ruffle any feathers, right? They sort of bowed to the pressure, and unfortunately, I think that really pissed Gary Webb off. He eventually left and decided just to like write his own book.
yeah, I mean, like I said earlier in our conversation, that he got canceled before the term existed, and I get it. Like it could really be devastating because you had a, you know, you had a career, you had a way of thinking, a way of working, a worldview even, and that's all shattered. And you know, it's not easy to just to rebound, you know. And I think, honestly, that's I think what happened was that like he hit rock bottom, and like you said, even though he wrote the book, The Dark Alliance, like it's, you know, it stayed that way because I think I don't know many journalists, but from what I understand of journalistic culture, it's like after you're always, after you make a big story, you want to hit the next, you know, big story. Like, you want to keep it going, you know.
Yeah.
And he was stuck. He was trapped in time basically because the world moved on, and he was like, "Wait a second, you left me here. What the heck? Like, I never got the acknowledgement I was seeking. Like, I was trying to, you know, share the truth here." Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I view him in the light of sort of a tragic hero. I think he was trying to do what was right, and unfortunately, the system just pushed back against him. I think he could have put himself in a better position if he had gotten some more concrete sources. And I'm sure there were some. His story was not completely airtight, but unfortunately, I don't think that justified essentially what happened to him.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I think you had a good point about like just like the time period, because I think that definitely like had a factor too, because I think that time period it was probably harder to do what he was trying to do. And also he was a journalist. Like it wasn't like he wasn't deep throat like spreading the story and then saying, "Look, my name's out there, I'm hiding now." You know, he like you said, it was his career. He was thinking that he was gonna write another piece. Like, look, even Glenn Greenwald, that guy who I disagree with him sometimes, he's still like out and about. It's not like he got, you know, totally deplatformed, you know.
No. The one thing that I kind of found interesting was sort of the what actually led him onto this sort of rabbit hole of uncovering the story was the fact that he gained a reputation covering California's asset forfeiture cases and drug cases. Something that is not very well known, or at least covered, was during the 80s and 90s. If police sort of suspected you of selling drugs, they could, before even proving that you were doing so, they could seize all of your assets at the house, which was mind-blowing in terms of a ridiculous violation of civil liberties to me. And so in terms of that sort of writing, I really view him in a very positive light because he was trying to uncover a lot of abuses that were sort of going on during that time in his writings, in investigative journalism.
And look, even in like, I think the LAPD is famous for this, but like, especially in the drug, because like I said, like if you read the book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop, great book by the way, you know, it is covered there that like the war on drugs enabled police to have a lot more, I'm going to say, powers that they didn't have before. And one of those powers was that if it was related to drugs, if, like you said, this asset seizures, but also if they did have drugs, they seized those drugs and they were supposed to just, you know, confiscate them. But we do know that through other people who've broken stories that, especially with the FBI, that like that wasn't exactly the case, you know.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to hear sort of, I guess, some firsthand accounts of like how how deep this sort of story sort of goes, you can look at interviews with basically who was the biggest seller of cocaine and crack cocaine in LA in the early 80s, which was Highway Ricky Ross, which Gary Webb actually interviews within the movies, played by one of the Wire actors. But there's a lot of accounts where he gives where he's like, essentially, he's like, at a certain point in the 80s, drug dealers were smart. They would sort of always keep the money away from where the drugs were kept, right? That way would never mix the two, and the cops could never like claim to like take anything. And so what ended up happening is that after a while, cops sort of got fed up with this, and he's like, yeah, there were plenty of times like later on as we were sort of going on within our drug business where you started getting cops that would started planting drugs on us just so they could seize the money, right? And then you can't, once drugs were planted, you can be like, no, that's my money, but those aren't my drugs, right? Because what judge is necessarily going to believe that? But what ended up happening, it was mind-blowing, is apparently, this was, I don't know if you know this story, but it was like really interesting hearing this dude talk about it. He actually got pissed, this guy, Ricky Ross, down in LA, he was pissed that they were like planting drugs. So he hired a former cop as he hired a private investigator who was a former cop to investigate LAPD units. And so he would go and interview neighbors, people that they were like confiscating supposed drug homes from. And so he compiled all this list, and he found a lot of discrepancies in terms of what the LAPD was actually saying they found at the house, versus what was actually like happening, right? So he found that there was a lot of corruption going on. Apparently this somehow got leaked all the way up to like the FBI, and the FBI sent sort of an agent to pose as like a drug member. Well, the LAPD busted on this agent and planted drugs on him, and it led to a large indictment of people there in LAPD at that point, which is mind-blowing, right? You're trying to plant drugs on someone who was an FBI agent.
Yeah, I mean,
so basically, he was at a home.
I did know about that part with the LAPD. They got busted. Yeah, I mean, the LAPD is a whole nother like hour of conversation, but yeah.
Yeah. But one thing that was sort of interesting that I'll finish up. So at that point, once Ricky Ross was sort of at the height of his game, they had a task force that was like the Highway Ricky Ross task force. And essentially how this sort of got, because the LAPD is a very complex, has a lot of corrupt history within it, that sort of eventually offshooted into what became in the early 90s as the Crash Unit Task Force, which is part of like the LAPD Rampart scandal, which was the inspiration from the movie Training Day. And so there was like a long string of sort of corruption charges there. And it was really interesting seeing the sort of timeline of that from the 80s and 90s in the LAPD.
That's interesting, yeah. Yeah, I mean...
Sorry, I sort of went off tangent about that, but it's just interesting how all of that is sort of connected together.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about our conversation today is that we barely talked about the movie to a degree. But, yeah.
Well, this movie was very much a biography that was... it was obviously sensationalized to make it more of an entertainment. But what was really crucial, why I wanted to touch upon this, is because this was a biography on a very interesting story and a very interesting point in time in U.S. history.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, actually, it was my point that like biographical films, that's like the tricky part, or like, you want to make it an interesting movie, but you're kind of visually showing just you're visually showing facts and events versus like, some kind of theme, like versus like a different type of movie where you're kind of like exploring themes or film styles or something like that. Like, you're not going to do anything too crazy in like somebody's biography, right? Like,
most biographies are not. The one that I will say that was more interesting or had more of a creative take is partly because the director was Malcolm X by Spike Lee.
Yeah, but even then...
So one documentary that had a more creative direction.
Yeah, but
even some of the visuals.
Yeah, but even then, you're right. compared to other biographies. But even then, because I've seen other Spike Lee films, even he felt like Kushner. He didn't want to like do weirder things
Of course.
about Malcolm's life, you know.
But like in terms of some of the visuals, like it had that Spike Lee-esque feel to it.
Yeah, it did have a
even though it was a biography.
That is true.
So overall, would you recommend this movie?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend it. It's a good like sit down, like chat and eat kind of a movie. I know we're gonna get into ratings, and actually, I gotta start writing these down because I don't even remember what I rate other films. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those type of movies. It's not a movie that I'm probably gonna rewatch. To be honest with you, like there's other movies that I want to see, and like rewatching now, I realize it takes time. So like, yeah, it's just there's only so much time in a week or in a month. But it was definitely a movie that like if it was like on Netflix and it just happened to show up and if nobody's seen it in the whatever living room or whatever, I would probably play it on. I don't know, how do you feel about the film? It's like when you're top 50.
I thought it was good. No, I mean I think it's compared to, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I think compared to like other, like I personally preferred other films that we reviewed in terms of just the direction that they've gone, in the filmmaking process. But I think this is a more digestible film in the way it's shot and storyline. Like it's obviously a biography, and I think it touches upon a story that is very little known to the most of the American public, and I think it's a very important one that really sort of explains where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's
in a lot of ways.
I think that's
in that way, based on that sort of significance, I would totally recommend it because I think a lot more people should know about this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. Yeah, but I would pick other movies as an entry point for people, but that's another topic.
Or for what exactly?
For like drugs and like, America's not clean involvement in that, what I call the war on drugs, or actually not what I call, but what other, like the supposed phrase, quote, war on drugs. But
I mean, there are probably other movies, but this is just very interesting because it tackles it from the media standpoint.
The media angle, yeah.
Right. I mean,
I give you that point.
This touches upon a lot of different things and how they all sort of work together. Right. I mean, there's other drug TV series and films where you can sort of that touch upon this topic. This does it from a different angle that's very little seen. Most people don't know the story of Gary Webb and how this really broke as really the first major piece to blow up online.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't even know about his story really until I watched this movie. So that's a fair point.
Right, and so for that reason, I think it's very important because it was sort of the pre-catalyst for what happened with a lot of, WikiLeaks documentation for intelligence agencies, Julian Assange, and what ended up happening with Eric Snowden.
Yeah.
In many ways, I think Gary Webb enabled these people to break stories like this.
We're going to get into ratings?
Yeah, I mean, so I personally like Jeremy Renner. I liked his acting. I didn't think he did a bad job in this film, portraying Gary Webb. I think he tried to humanize him in the best way that he could, in terms of making him, care about his kids, a family man, if you will. I'd probably give this film about a 7.
Yeah, that's fair. I would say that, like, I mean, I thought Jeremy Renner was good. I actually thought even Mary Elizabeth Winstead was pretty good. I know that she's not as well known. She's been in a lot of movies. I feel like I've seen her like face a lot, but like I never I always think like, what movie do I know her for? And I'm like, I can't even like, I
can't really think, right?
Yeah, I can't even think of like, I don't think she has like a magna opus, like a great like master, like her career defining like whatever trilogy of films. Like other actors, like like even like DiCaprio, you think of like, Titanic and all these iconic roles he's done, Inception and Revenant. I would say I'll give this one like a 6. Like on my scale, it's always like 1 through 10, 10 masterpiece, 5 average. This is
I feel like a lot of times like
it's a little bit.
I feel like we have a deviation of about 0.5 to 1.
Yeah, it seems like that's the case. Like it's like I would say like 5.56. I'm gonna go with six, a little bit higher just because of the San Jose angle. But it's just to me it's a slightly above
Yeah, I
average
mean,
movie that's very watchable, and like it's a good topic. But like when I think of like cinema as art, I wouldn't put that movie because we're doing film, right? I don't
no.
put that film in that kind of category.
So we're a movie review podcast, and when we do it based on the movie itself. Why we are what you notice we didn't talk about a lot of the elements of the movie specifically because it's a fairly linear storyline in terms of what's going on, and it's a biography, if you will. So really, the majority of our commentary today was on the cultural aspects of like what this film was touching upon.
Yeah.
And most of the time, it's not going to be quite to this extent, but for this film, it just touched so many different aspects of society and how they all sort of tied together on this sort of controversy on the war on drugs in the United States.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that, like even like, and the reason I think my score is kind of like where it is because also this specific film and films like it, there's also not really, there is character drama, but it's a biographical character drama. So it's not like a film where it has the same mechanics of like, oh, it takes place in Seattle and it's about two brothers, right? And it's like the director and writer kind of like create whatever story they want because they're trying to explore some theme. I'm trying to think if we covered a film that was kind of like that, where like it was still like not fantastical or super like weird editing or anything, but like it was just like normal. But it's like it was trying to, like, this film was, like I said, I think that also this is also the issue with, not the issue, but this is also the trigger when it's based on a book, right? This is where you see like you have some kind of like novel to movie translation decisions, and also, like I said, just the circumstance of like it's trying to cover like somebody's a slice of somebody's life. So I think that's also tricky too, because like you could say that look, here's a good one, a good example is American History X, right? It's like it's based off a lot of themes and like experiences the screenplay like the writer had, but obviously combined with acting and some directorial touches, it creates like it becomes its own like
its own unique aesthetic.
Yeah, it's unique aesthetic, and but even then, the initial origin is like based on what he's seen, like the themes that he wants to explore after what he's experienced and seen. While this is like based off like things that actually happened. This guy actually talked to these individuals. He wrote this piece, and this is what happened to him. So it is tricky in that sense too. That's why I feel like I do have some constraints.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you're restricted to the story, right? And the story's already laid out, and that sort of limits any sort of additional creativity that you may want to put into the film. So for that, I have some understanding, but based on like the product of the film itself, what we watched, it wasn't a super unique film in terms of any of cinematography and anything that I feel like if Spike Lee made this movie, he still would have put his own little twist on it to make it a little more unique, or there's certain directors that can do that, but when you have sort of the generic plug and chug, there was nothing super special about the film. Now
that we're doing this podcast, I've realized that like there are levels to directors. I don't have it all like labeled out like what they are, but like I had never heard of Michael Cuesta before, and I tried to think of like look at his film list, and I was like, I don't think I've seen many of these. And now that we're on episode 11, I mean, I could tell that he's like a step down. I hate to be hard on the guy, but like it's like it's difficult. Like now I'm starting to see like, oh, there is a range of like good, great, excellent directors or mediocre ones. So,
I mean, it doesn't seem like he's directed a ton in general, but he's more on the, from looking at his list, he's more known for directing television episodes and TV series.
Yeah, I think when I looked him up, he was more known for
that might be more of his forte.
Like you said, TV episodes, but also on the producer side too, which is different.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a different media. Like we said this earlier with, oh my gosh, we talked about this before. Who was the director for Annihilation and Ex Machina?
It's that Canadian French guy, right? Forgot his name.
Oh my
But yeah,
gosh.
he did
Look that
that,
up real quick.
and I haven't finished it yet because it's.
So my point is, like, oftentimes what you'll be well known for one type of film media, but not the other, right? So sometimes people are really good at telling stories in a TV series type of platform, but not in movies. And sometimes you're really good at movies, but that doesn't always translate to TV series.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
But yeah. Anyway, do you have any like sort of last final thoughts on this?
No, I think we covered everything. So I think, well, I'll speak to it because I'm picking next week's film. So next week we're going to be discussing, I believe, I'm pretty sure it's the directorial, like it's like the first like real full length feature film that Jonah Hill ever, I think, wrote, produced, and directed, the mid '90s. So that should be a. I don't think we're gonna get as political, but that will also be
a little nostalgic.
It's a bit nostalgic, but I think that there's gonna be, I think we're gonna have some interesting conversation points in that film. So,
sure. I mean, we had quite a few in ones within this film. So obviously, it was very far-reaching.
Yeah, and so that's you know, that's the next that'll be next week's
cool.
episode.
Well, that's good to know. I guess my last point with this, and I sort of touched upon it throughout, but it's just so sad that, you know, you tend to think that the government's, like I said, ideally like on your side, but it's sad that you would sort of turn a blind eye towards like the destruction of like communities and enable a lot of this destruction to like happen, to fall out within, you know, like the crack cocaine epidemic.
Yeah,
that's really like the big takeaway from this. It's like mind-blowing how this was sort of been able to go on, whether sort of overtly, like directly or indirectly.
So I guess I do have a question around, I guess, do you believe he committed suicide, or was it he needed to be silenced? I know there's a lot of conspiracies around it, so I'm curious what you end up landing on.
I mean, honestly, I don't, in this case, I don't know. He was already discredited. He couldn't get a job anywhere, because that was the other thing that I was trying to get to you, where was he systematically sort of, you know, was this systematic character assassination?
That definitely happened. So
yeah, I mean, he was hosed from any sort of job once he left and tried. Like, he would have a successful career. He was a good investigative journalist, and yet after he left and published a book and tried to get other jobs, they would not hire him anywhere. I think he just fell into like a large state of depression. He was bankrupt, basically, and I think that's the way that the CIA sort of done him. They didn't need to kill him.
That's what
they just ruined his life.
He was definitely like labeled as a black sheep, and like I said, like they don't even have to at that point even, like I said, do the act, because it's already, they did so much already that like he will never have a platform. So
he didn't, and I think that what his life ended up turning into was just enough to push him over the edge.
Exactly.
So sadly, but yeah, it's sort of unbelievable that. I think it was more indirectly that the CIA would allow drugs to flow into a lot of communities here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was sort of my last final points. Because if you think about it, in a way, governments sort of allow the current opioid crisis to fester and blow up all over the U.S. by making it super easy for doctors and pharmaceutical companies to distribute painkillers and pain medication prescriptions.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of parallels where they sort of enable a lot of these horrible crises to occur.
Yeah, I mean, and that goes back to lobbyists and corruption, all that stuff. But
yeah.
But we'll leave it at that. So
yeah, I think that's the last bit. And so if you enjoyed our commentary, and there was a lot of cultural commentary today regarding the film Kill the Messenger, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned next week when we'll be reviewing Jonah. You said it was Jonah Hill's first film?
I believe so. I mean, I want to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that was his first like full feature length. He wrote, produced, and directed. So.
Well, what's the exact name of the film? I don't want to get
mid '90s.
Mid-90s. Yeah, so stay tuned next week when we will be reviewing mid-90s. So we'll see you.